Welcome back. We are going to continue our study of the musculoskeletal system. We have looked at the skeleton, we've looked at joints, and now we're going to move on to muscles. So, when we think of muscular tissue, we know this is one of our four major types of tissue. So we had epithelium, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. Whenever we see sarco or myo as a prefix, it's indicating that we're dealing with some type of muscular something or other. So there are three types, remember from learning in your tissues. We had skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle is obviously going to be attached to the skeleton. It is striated or striped in appearance, and it is voluntary in how it's going to move, so how it's going to be prompted to move. Cardiac is found only in the heart. It is also striated, but it is involuntary, so it is not under your conscious control. And then smooth is found in the walls of all of your hollow organs, so the entire gut, running down the posterior side of your trachea, lining all of your blood vessels. So any of your hollow organs are going to have smooth muscle associated with them. So there's several characteristics of muscles that make them have the ability to do what they do. First is that they are excitable. So this means that they can receive and respond to an electrical signal. Okay, we're going to be talking in probably the next section about the signals, the action potentials, which are really electrical signals. So muscles can respond to these signals that come from the nervous system. They are contractile, meaning they have the ability to shorten. They have extensibility, meaning they have the ability to stretch. And they have elasticity, which means that they have the ability to recoil. So all of those characteristics are what allow muscles to do what they do. So what do? They're going to help us move, obviously. In the sort of constant realm of muscle contraction, your muscles are responsible for maintaining the overall position and posture of your body. We talked about how muscles are the primary stabilizing force for all of your joints. Muscles do generate heat. That's why you begin to shiver when you are cold. You begin to contract your muscles so that you can generate more heat. They are protective of internal organs, particularly in the abdomen. And they're going to form valves. When we talk about smooth muscle, when we talk about the valves running through the digestive system or something like that, that's all muscular in structure. So, gross anatomy. We're talking about muscles as the organ of the muscular system. And if you remember what the definition of an organ was, is it was various tissues that work together. So in a muscle, we have obviously muscle tissue. We've got a blood supply. We have a nerve supply. We've got tons of connective tissue. So certainly a muscle does fit our definition for what an organ is. So let's talk about this connective tissue. Muscle is highly organized. We start with what's called the epimysium. It is a layer of dense, irregular connective tissue that surrounds the entire muscle. And then you've got the perimysium, which is going to be deep to that, and it's going to be a fibrous connective tissue that's going to surround each what's called fascicle. And then the endomysium is going to be a thinner connective tissue layer that's going to surround each muscle fiber. So let's take a look at that. So here you have the entire muscle as a whole. Okay, so cross-section through the whole muscle. And running along the outside, this layer right here, that is your epimysium. So this would go all the way around the muscle. Okay. Now, you can see that the muscle is divided into these units. Each one of these is called a fascicle. Okay. So the connective tissue surrounding each of these fascicles is the perimysium. So you can see it here on a slide. This is your paramecium sort of running through in these areas here. Okay, so this is your fascicle right there. Okay. Oh, cool. Here you can see some of the striations in muscle as well. And then fascicles, here's one, are going to be made up of individual muscle fibers that are going to be surrounded by an endomysium surrounding this. So in here, your endomysium is surrounding each one of these muscle fibers. Okay. So there's a hierarchy of structure that happens here. And muscles are incredibly organized in their structure. So the connective tissues, oftentimes, particularly in a limb, are going to separate the muscles of a limb into different compartments. And these are fairly tightly bound by the connective tissue here. So here we're looking through the calf muscle. So the anterior component is here. So here's your tibia, here's your fibula, and then here's your posterior deep, here's your posterior superficial. So this is gastrocnemius here, this is soleus. These are your fibularis muscles here. So it's tibialis anterior right there. So these muscles tend to work similarly to each other, and so you have kind of compartments that deal with specific muscles due to the connective tissue. Now, this can also lead to something called compartment syndrome. If you begin to collect fluid or blood into one of these, this connective tissue will not really give. We know it's not super flexible, and it can start causing significant pain and damage to the muscle because it's going to cut off blood flow. So usually they have to go in and they have to very quickly cut this connective tissue open to release the pressure that's building in there. Okay, so let's talk about how the fascicles are arranged in a muscle. We have multiple different ways to do this. We have what's called fusiform. So this basically has kind of a thicker middle where we call the belly, and then it thins out on either end. So biceps brachii is a good example of fusiform. Parallel means all of the muscle fibers are running in a very straight manner. So rectus abdominis is parallel, sartorius is parallel. Triangular, you've got multiple fascicles that are all sort of coming towards one point. So this looks like a triangle here. So pec major falls into this category. Unipennate, bipennate, and multipennate are all kind of related. Here you have a piece of connective tissue that runs up into the muscle, and then you're going to have fibers coming off of that all the way up the length of the connective tissue. Okay, so an example of unipennate, which means that there's only fibers coming off of one side, is the interosseous muscles in your hand. Bipennate looks like a feather, so there are fascicles coming off in both directions. So rectus femoris is bipennate. Multipennate basically has kind of like you take a bunch of bipennate ones and put them together. Deltoid is going to be a multipennate muscle. When you look at the deltoid, it looks like, particularly in models, it looks like it's just this smooth muscle that goes anterior to posterior and then comes down and inserts on the humerus. But in fact, there's actually 3 separate groups to the deltoid, which explains its multiple actions on the arm. You've got an anterior group that is going to flex the arm. You've got a lateral group that is going to abduct the arm. And then you have a posterior group that is going to extend or hyperextend. So each one of those is making up a portion of deltoid. So this is multipennate. And then you have circular. So you've got orbicularis oculi and orbicularis oris. Circular is the weakest of all of these arrangements. The strongest are something like multipennate. This has to do with the number of fascicles in the muscle. Strength of a muscle, or a better terminology would be how much tension a muscle could generate, is directly proportional to the number of cross bridges that it can form. And the number of cross bridges is directly proportional to the number of fascicles. So the more fascicles I can have, so here you have very long, straight fascicles, but there's only so many of them. Over here, you've got tons of them coming off in both directions from each one of these pieces of connective tissue. So the more fascicles, the more strength. This has very few fascicles. Okay, they all come together, they go around, but there's not very many of them, so it's not very strong. Okay, so now we have to talk about how muscles are going to attach to the bones that they are going to work on. So here we're looking at the brachial region. So here are biceps brachii, brachialis, and triceps brachii. So we're dealing with the forearm bones, the humerus, and the scapula in terms of the attachment points. Classically, we called the attachments insertions and origins. And so origins tended to be the more stable of the attachments, while insertions tended to be the more movable. So the best way for me to explain this to you is to tell you to put your arm in correct anatomical position and then flex your elbow. Okay, so biceps brachii is helping out in that action there. Biceps brachii has attachments in the shoulder and in the forearm. When you flex your elbow, the shoulder attachments stay very stable while the forearm attachments are moving. So using the classical definition, the shoulder attachments would be the origin, the forearm attachments would be the insertion. Now, we are moving towards calling everything an attachment and perhaps indicating proximal and distal for the differentiation. So I think it's going to take a while for this to really catch on. However, your textbook does use attachments. It does not differentiate them into the insertion and the origin anymore. But I think that it's going to take a little bit of time for the entire community to move towards getting rid of the concept of insertions and origins and just calling everything either a proximal or a distal attachment. So in terms of biceps brachii, your proximal attachment would be in the shoulder and your distal attachment would be down here on the radius. Okay. Now classically, the origin is in the shoulder and the insertion is on the radius. The way muscles can attach to bones can be either direct. You can see a good example of that right here and here, okay, brachialis and triceps brachii, where there is connective tissue between the muscle and the bone, but it is so short that you can't see it. It looks as if the muscle attaches directly to the bone. Or you have indirect, which is what you're probably more used to seeing in the form of a tendon. So the muscle fibers end here, and then we go into a tendon that attaches to the bone. Another version of an indirect would be an aponeurosis. So we see this in the abdomen and the top of the head, where the muscles are going to insert into a sheet of connective tissue. So we want to talk a little bit about how muscles work here. Something to remember, muscles can pull, but they can't push. Okay, so a muscle can only pull on the bone that it is attached to. It cannot push the bone. All it can do is shorten. So all it can do is pull on the bone. Put your arm back in correct anatomical position. And again, we're going to flex the elbow. Okay, so when we're flexing the elbow, we are pulling on the bones in the forearm. We're pulling on the radius, and it's moving the elbow toward the body, so it's flexing. Now, when we want to go back into extension, it's not biceps brachii pushing the arm back down. It's triceps brachii on the other side of the arm, the posterior side of the arm, pulling the bones back down. Okay? So muscles can't push, they can only pull. We just talked about this concept of the insertion origin. Generally, the insertion is going to be the more movable. Okay, so here with our example, we're talking about the points of attachment in the forearm. Triceps brachii has that same concept. The attachments down in the forearm tend to be more movable, so when triceps brachii contracts, we pull the forearm back into extension. So, something to remember, whatever one muscle group does, another has to undo. Biceps brachii and brachialis flex the elbow. Triceps brachii extends it. Muscles can't flex and extend the same thing. Something flexes it and something else extends it. And another thing to think about is that oftentimes people tend to think of extension as simply the absence of flexion. If you are standing in correct anatomical position, pretty much everything is extended. That's because those muscles are contracting and pulling on those bones. It's not because you're simply not flexing, okay? Your shoulders are extended, your neck is extended, your trunk is extended, elbows, wrists, fingers are all extended, hips are extended, okay? Knee is extended. The muscles that are extensors are what are allowing that posture, okay? When you go to flex, you are using now another set of muscles. So as a tip, you want to make sure that when you're writing down the action of a muscle, you don't write down, it flexes and extends. It can't. It can either flex or extend, okay? So one muscle cannot do opposing actions on the same joint. So let's get this functional group concept. As you begin to learn actions, you're going to see some of this terminology. Prime mover, or what are known as agonists, are the main muscle that is going to cause an action to occur. So we're going to go back to elbow flexion because it's an easy one. When we flex our elbow, the prime mover of that movement is brachialis. It's not biceps brachii. Okay, brachialis is the agonist. Biceps brachii is what's called a synergist. It helps the movement. Okay, it makes the movement better. It makes it more stable. It adds strength or tension to the movement. So synergists work with other muscles to do something. An antagonist works in the opposite. So if brachialis and biceps brachii are flexing the elbow, triceps brachii is the antagonist. It's going to extend it. The fourth one you'll see occasionally are fixators. So fixators are going to help stabilize joints so something else can happen. Okay, the rhomboids are fixators on your scapula so that when you do all of these movements with your arms using biceps brachii, your scapula does not lose its stability because you've got the rhomboids that pull on it and are going to fixate it. Okay. Now, naming. Sometimes we name for locations. Okay, temporalis, intercostals. Okay, femoris means leg. Popliteus is the popliteal region. So a lot of times we're going to name muscles based on their location. Sometimes we use the shape. Rhomboids, trapezius, are named for trapezoids and rhomboids. Okay, Deltoid, if you know what the Greek letter delta looks like, it's an equilateral triangle. Flip it upside down. Okay, you've got the deltoid muscle. Size, so when you see maximus or magnus, it means big. Longus means long. Brevis means short. So a lot of times, like your adductors, your adductors in your inner thigh, you've got a magnus, a brevis, and a longus. Okay. The directionality, so rectus means straight, transverse means in the transverse plane, oblique means running in a diagonal. Okay, so those are really important for something like the abdominal muscles. The number of origins, so we've got a biceps, we've got biceps brachii, we've got biceps femoris, which is why we don't just call it the biceps. Okay, triceps, quadriceps, just telling you how many origins we have. The attachment locations, so sternocleidomastoid is telling you exactly where it goes. Sterno means sternum, cleido means clavicle. So you've got a point of attachment on the sternum and the clavicle, and then it runs diagonally up your neck, posteriorly, and attaches on the mastoid process of the temporal bone. So sternocleidomastoid. It's telling you exactly where it lies in the body. And then last thing that we could add in would be the actions. So when something says it's a flexor carpi ulnaris, for example, that's telling you something. Flexor means that it's going to flex something. Carpi means wrist. So it's going to flex your wrist. And ulnaris means that it's a location. It's running on the pinky side of the forearm. So flexor carpi ulnaris tells you there's a whole bunch of information in the name of the muscle. Okay? So this is where kind of knowing that the regional anatomy and knowing that the carpals, you know, you're building on the information that you have learned before. All right, so here's your muscle dudes, okay? We're not going to go into this because this is something that you're doing in lab, so I'm not going to ask you to identify muscles in lecture. You're going to do all of that in lab, so, you know, you'll get plenty of that in the lab. I did add these in. They're from another book, but they are just tables that basically divide the muscles up into what they act on and then what they do. So we're looking at the shoulder here, everything that flexes it, everything that extends it, abducts, adducts, medial rotators, lateral rotators. So there's your shoulder. Here's forearm, wrist, and fingers. And then there's your thigh and leg. Okay, so here's actions at the hip versus actions at the knee. All right, so they might be helpful. They're from a different book, so I just wanted to throw them in here so that you guys would have something to reference.